And I'll be the moderator for this session today. The title of today's seminar is Spotlighting Ecosystem Services, Insights from 3 International Initiatives. The concept of ecosystem services is central to the theory of natural capital, a concept developed rigorously in the United Kingdom over the past 7 or so years. Now, over the past decade, the use of the term has mushroomed into the international arena, and it can be instructive, perhaps, to see how these terms are interpreted and understood and responded to in different contexts. Does one encounter challenges when working with these concepts internationally? Has ecosystem services research internationally contributed to our understanding of natural capital? What can we learn from these programs about communicating these concepts to diverse audiences? Now, today we have 3 presenters who will help us explore this topic. Each will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Participants online may submit questions at any time through the chat function. But I would suggest that the audience in the room hold their questions, apart from those for clarification, until the Q&A period after all the speakers have finished. And remember, when you speak up, speak clearly. Lucy and Joe today will be my technical assistants. If online participants run into any problems, you may contact them through the chat line in the webinar system for assistance. Now let me briefly introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Kate Schrekenberg, presently Reader in Development Geography at King's College London. She will speak to us today about her work as a director of the recently concluded DFID-funded interdisciplinary research program, Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation, or ESPA. Then we have Dolf de Groot, Associate Professor in the Environmental Systems Analysis Group of the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. He will speak about Ecosystem Services Partnership, or ESP, of which he is the Executive Chair. Finally, we have our own Diana Mortimer, co-team leader of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services team in JNCC, and a long-standing advisor to DEFRA on IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and MAZE, Mapping and Assessment of Ecosystem Services. Now, over to Kate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Diana's already introduced me. I'll be talking to you a little bit about what the ESPA program was and its academic findings, and also interspersing that with some of the development impact that resulted from those findings. So first of all, it was ESPA, or Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation, was a research program that lasted for about 9 years, funded jointly by the Department for International Development with 2 of the UK's research councils, the Natural Environment Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council. And it was really designed to respond to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, which obviously reported that the ecosystem services on which we all depend were declining very rapidly at the time. So the goal of the program was to ensure that ecosystems would be conserved and managed more sustainably, but in ways that alleviate poverty and enhance well-being. And it's worth noting that at the time of the design of the program, the term natural capital really wasn't used very much at all. Even ecosystem services was still a little bit new in research, but natural capital definitely wasn't being used that much in the context of UK ODA. So ESPA, broadly, it funded about 120 research projects in over 50 countries, working with almost 1,000 researchers in the global north and south, and was very successful in terms of numbers of publications. That figure on the screen is from when we finished last summer, so I think we're probably up to about 500 now. What was interesting was that citation rates for ESPA papers tended to be higher, were in fact significantly higher than for other papers in the field, suggesting that it's certainly an area, and the research that was being done, was of great interest to other academics. That wasn't the only interest that the funders had. Because of the high proportion of DFID funding, 70% of the funding was from DFID, there was a strong emphasis on making sure that the research that was done by ESPA actually helped to achieve development impact. And it was quite innovative at the time, I think, that the program in emphasizing the need for interdisciplinarity within research teams, that teams should employ systems thinking, that there had to be partners in both the global south as well as the north, and trying to encourage researchers to use quite innovative methods for data collection and analysis, and wherever possible not to do research in a kind of extractive mode, but to work with stakeholders and to provide feedback to stakeholders to ensure that the research findings actually got turned into some kind of implemented in some kind of way. So we spent the last year of the program synthesizing what had been done by all these 120 or so projects, and you can access a detailed version of the synthesis in an open access book, and then there's also another link on the screen for the ESPA headlines, which is obviously a more condensed version and available in 6 languages for those of you who might prefer to read it in a different language. I'm going to summarize the findings into 3 broad areas, and the first of these is that many environmental interventions have costs for the poorest and most marginalized in society. And while we like to talk about win-wins, ESPA's research really showed that by going in with a win-win expectation, this can actually blind us to the almost inevitable trade-offs that exist or that happen on the ground. And I can give you a couple of examples, very different kinds of examples. Land use intensification, often carried out with the best of intentions to increase production of ecosystem services like food and fiber or biofuels. So it can appear very positive. In the case of Rwanda, for example, the crop intensification program they had reduced aggregate poverty, but detailed analysis by ESPA researchers showed that poorer people often lacked the capacity to participate in the program and sometimes lost their land as a result. Also, their nutritional security declined because the variety of crops they grew really was much smaller than previously. At the other extreme, you've got protected areas, which, as we know, are a key intervention for biodiversity conservation, but quite a few ESPA projects were looking at the impact of protected areas and found that the costs to local people were underestimated. And those costs are often related to people having to change their land use practice, so not being able to graze their animals, for example, in a protected area, or no longer being able to practice shifting cultivation. Also, human-wildlife conflict is a big problem, and compensation was often far too little, far too late, or entirely absent in these cases. So how does one deal with these trade-offs? Sometimes they just seem far too complex, but complexity should not be an excuse for inaction. And we have one good case study of the ESPA Deltas project, which really focused on trying to highlight these trade-offs and make them explicit to decision makers to inform better decision making. So this project was working in Bangladesh and particularly looking at the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna Delta, and the government was in the process of developing a plan to how to manage the delta to the year 2100, and they wanted to look at, for example, the different impacts of alternative interventions to reduce coastal flooding, like, do they build a seawall, do they plant more mangrove strips, or do they construct polders? And in that particular case, the model that they had built, that the team had built, showed that actually polders were most effective when you looked at the decision making from a poverty reduction perspective. But the model also highlighted quite a lot of trade-offs that they hadn't been aware of in advance, which was that by protecting one area against flood risk, you could displace flood risk to other areas, that you could also risk the very poor losing their land by making it more valuable with the polders, and polders ultimately only work if they're maintained. So the cost is more than just the cost of construction, it's also the cost of maintenance. A second area that ESPA really did a lot of work on was well-being and how the environment contributes to different groups of people meeting their well-being aspirations. And this is partly at the root of why there are so many trade-offs, because we all want to use different aspects of the environment and different ecosystem services in different ways. And one area that we found that there'd been far too little research on was around how women versus men might use their environment. So there's more understanding now about how poorer and less poor people use the environment, but women's use of the environment is still very under-researched, even though we know that many activities in life are highly gendered. So firewood collection, for example, is often the responsibility of women, which means that they are or tend to be more reliant on common property resources, and those are exactly the resources that might be used in a land use intensification program, or might be lost, if you like, to a protected area intervention. So hearing people's voices on that is really important. We also found that, many cases highlighted that well-being is not something that you achieve, full stop. It's a very dynamic process, and people's well-being aspirations change over time. So how they use their environment to fulfill their well-being aspiration changes. And we need to look at a much broader set of measures than just the more conventional kind of household income measure of whether or not people have achieved their well-being goals. Interestingly enough, even though poverty is in the title of the ESPA program, researchers really shifted away from using poverty, which emphasizes what people lack, to a focus on well-being, which is much more concerned with what people have, what they can do, and how they think about what they have and can do. And rather than labeling people as poor, well-being kind of understands that they have often quite innovative strategies, which often rely very heavily on ecosystem services to enhance their well-being. And a project that tried to take that idea forward was one that was working with the statistics offices in Rwanda and Malawi and the UN Poverty and Environment Initiative to look at how more conventional measures of poverty, like the Multidimensional Poverty Index, could perhaps be expanded to include environmental aspects as well. And the third area of kind of main findings for ESPA was really the issue of good governance and environmental justice. This takes into account that it's through institutions and hence governance it's institutions that determine how people can access and use their environment, their natural capital, to obtain the different services that they need. And it may seem obvious that one needs to have good governance principles, but we're still far from achieving those. And in particular, when one talks about things like accountability, it was very clear that we need to be sure to be looking at accountability downwards to affected populations rather than just accountability upwards. Similarly, participation is an area that we still haven't got quite right to ensure that poorer and more marginalized people actually have a voice in decisions. The issue of adaptive governance also came up a lot because we live in such a dynamic world of constant change. It's not just climate change, it's also rapid urbanization and changing production systems. So governance needs to be very adaptive to that. And particularly recognizing that local people are not always able to take decisions in an unconstrained matter, but that their decisions are constrained by decisions that are taken at district, national, and international level. And we really pinpointed in ESPA a lack of good governance mechanisms that translate or that communicate across those different levels. And finally, on this point, several ESPA projects really highlighted the utility of an environmental justice framework to try and help reconcile those diverse perspectives on environmental management and change. And environmental justice is composed really of recognition of different rights holders and stakeholders and their views, fair procedures to allow everybody to have a voice, and then distribution, thinking about not just distribution of benefits, but also of costs and risks in a way that is agreed by all. So a couple more projects. that look particularly at governance issues. This is an example of a Payments for Ecosystem Services project in Peru. We actually had quite a lot of PEST projects within the ESPA program, and this one deals with quite a huge PEST program, if you like, where the water company in Lima, which is essentially in a desert environment, is now working with communities in the Peruvian highlands to pay them quite large amounts of money to help them restore or to manage their landscape in a different way and restore pre-Inca canals to improve the water flow to Lima. But we also, some of the best examples of these water pest schemes were non-monetized. I think that's quite important to emphasize, that ecosystem services do not need to be valued in a monetary way. In fact, there were lots of examples of them being valued in non-monetary ways, which we have to keep in mind. And then the final project example is from Ghana. This was a project, there's a link to a film if you want to actually hear the voices of the people in the project telling you about it, but it was very participatory, working with smallholder farmers, with cocoa companies, the Ghana Forest Service and NGOs to come to some ways of managing forests that would improve both farmer livelihood and maintain the forest. And what was very clear there was that, again, it's not enough to focus just on improving farming methods and putting all the responsibility on the farmer, but you need policy changes, in this case, government policy changes on who owns trees to change the incentive structure for farmers to maintain trees on their land. You need changes in the companies' policies as well, both in how fairly they pay farmers, but also these particular companies, very large companies in Ghana, then put out a declaration for zero deforestation supply chains, which was a really good outcome of this project. So one needs to tackle issues in a very holistic manner, both socially holistic, socioeconomically and politically holistic, as well as looking at the whole ecosystem. So final slide then, just to think about natural capital and ecosystem services and how the two terms relate. Obviously, the natural capital is more the stock from which we derive a flow of ecosystem services, and got in brackets there, don't forget also that there are ecosystem disservices that people experience, and some of our management focus is much more focused on minimizing those disservices rather than maximizing services in some cases. I'd say one of the good things in the ESPA research, it did show that putting a value on ecosystem services, like in some of these pest systems, can greatly inform management decisions. But there is obviously a risk that by focusing too narrowly on just one or even a few ecosystem services, you won't conserve your natural capital and you won't benefit all people that have been benefiting in different ways from a particular ecosystem.
Okay, thanks to the organizers and Kate for your presentation about ESPA. Actually, ESPA started around the same time that we started with our Ecosystem Service Partnership, ESP, which started in 2008. As this introductory slide shows, it's a worldwide network that connects now over 3,000 people and more than 40 organizations from 85 countries. So it's really a global network to enhance the science, policy, and practice of ecosystem services. We are doing this, setting up this network, because we think it can help to address some of the key environmental problems that we are facing, like land degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, which are all affecting the quality of the environment of our lives and livelihoods. We also just heard from Kate, and it is costing us a lot of money. Now, these are really big numbers and very rough, of course, but somebody calculated that we are spending, or losing, if you like, at least $8 trillion per year on dealing with land degradation, climate change, and other issues that you could argue are related to the loss of natural capital and the ecosystem services that it's providing to us. Now, you might wonder, actually, when we know about all this. I mean, again, the ESPA program was running for 9 years, and unfortunately, still many of the issues I just showed here are still very present with us and still causing all these problems. One underlying reason is what you could call the kind of perverse economic system, which is basically still stimulating that this is happening. And I'm by training actually an ecologist, a landscape ecologist, but to help address these core problems that lead to non-sustainability is for myself an important driving force to work with ecosystem services and work with this ecosystem service partnership. Maybe in the meantime, you had a look at this statement by Pavan Sukhdev, who was the study leader of the TEEP study, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which was kind of the follow-up to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was mentioned by Kate. And he said society must urgently replace its defective economic compass. And the cartoon to the right shows that one problem is our short-term planning process, but actually there are more fundamental problems that we may want to discuss later on a little bit. Somebody called it outdated economics, which is still mainly looking upon those ecosystem services as being for free. More than 75% of all the ecosystem services that we recognize are not recognized in conventional market economics. So basically neglected to a large extent in decision making. The neglect of externalities, like pollination or land degradation, which is even aggravated by so-called perverse subsidies. We are still subsidizing the primary industry like fishery and forestry and agriculture. It's made sense maybe 50 or 100 years ago when there were still few people and a lot of nature and growing population. But nowadays, most of those subsidies only lead to more environmental degradations and problems. And finally, kind of a fundamental issue within current economic theories and practice is some misconceptions about how people and markets function. So we really need to get actually to the core of this if we want to make a difference. And that's what this concept of ecosystem services and especially natural capital tries to achieve. It provides kind of a language for natural and social scientists and economists to talk about these issues and hopefully come at some point to some common solutions. So we are doing that with the partnerships by creating lots of different working groups, working on many aspects of this problem. We have a number of thematic working groups looking at how to value those ecosystem services in monetary but also non-monetary terms, how to deal with trade-offs, financing mechanisms, and so on. Then we have biome-oriented working groups looking at what happens in forests and wetlands and marine systems in terms of ecosystem services. And a few years ago, we started with so-called sectoral working groups looking at how sectors like agriculture and conservation and the pharmaceutical industry are using or should be using this concept. Then we also reach out to the regions. So we have now actually regional chapters on all continents and more than 50 or 40 or 50 different national networks. And that is also still growing yearly. Then we try to support the people in the working groups and the national networks, but also beyond the partnership. This is all open access and open source if you go to our website. We develop databases and guidelines and some other services, which I will be talking about in a moment in a bit more detail. And finally, as a partnership, we like to get together, of course, within our own organization, but also reaching out to other organizations and organizing conferences. Here are some of the key services that we are providing. First of all, the network service itself, of course. To maintain a global network like this is a lot of work. So it's quite rewarding to see that people are responding to it and are signing up to join the partnership. Also, we like to stimulate work in practice in the field to develop case studies, and on the longer term, maybe a global network of showcases that demonstrate that working with this concept of ecosystem services really helps to not only improve the environment, but also the livelihood of local communities and also the regional and even national economy. There's a lot of data collected, of course, within our partnership, so we try to store that and make that accessible to people, among others to databases. This one that is listed here is focusing on the monetary value of ecosystem services, which we made as part of the TEEP study, which I mentioned earlier. This is total economic, the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity. Conferences and publications is an important way of reaching out, and one scientific journal that was started by ESP actually now 7 years ago in 2012, has become quite popular in only a short time. It has a very high impact factor. We also like to have face-to-face meetings with people to develop training programs and participate in webinars like this, and use those conferences that we organize for pre or post-conference training sessions. And since a few years, we are working together closely with an organization called Common Land. It's based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but it's active worldwide on large-scale landscape restoration projects in South Africa, Australia, the Netherlands, and a few other places. And basically, we are doing all this to demonstrate that investing in natural capital pays, to put it in the short term, but it pays in many different ways, of course, not only in economic terms, but also in providing returns of livelihood and other benefits. And an important message I also like to convey is that we still see money that we spend on nature conservation and restoration as a cost. It costs money, of course, but we should see it as an investment, just like investing in man-made infrastructure, new roads or urban areas, which cost a lot of money. But then the argument from economic point of view is that it also gives a lot of return in terms of increased economic activity. And I think it would help if we would look upon the money we spend on conservation and restoration is also an investment in our natural capital. A few examples of the case studies we are working on, and in this case from Common Land, this area in the south of Spain. Started now 3 years ago, working with local communities who created a local a cooperative called Alvalal, and they are reaching out to farmers to switch to more sustainable almond production and more multifunctional land use, intercropping with aromatics and basically bringing back the traditional type of land use actually in this quite arid environment, which was usually the more sustainable option. And in South Africa, we are working already for more than 10 years now with local communities to again restore the landscape that has been overgrazed mainly by goats. And after a while, they even created a local NGO called Living Lands to replant natural spekboom and again try to diversify the land use. And all this, like I mentioned earlier, to demonstrate that investing in natural capital pays in terms of economic returns, socially and environmentally. And with one of my colleagues from South Africa, James Blichno, he did a global meta-analysis of studies that we could find. Initially, we screened more than 90,000 publications looking at cost and benefit of landscape restoration and selected 95 studies, from which, partly to our own surprise, it turned out that for all ecosystems, the benefit cost ratio was positive, even for coral reefs, which are quite difficult to restore, but they do provide a lot of benefits. So in terms of benefit-cost ratio, even that was economically a positive business, if you like, to use that term. Our conferences, since the beginning, we started organizing meetings, and after a while we started calling them World Conference when we organized them for everyone to attend. But they became rapidly quite popular. So I think in 2016 we started a biannual cycle with our World Conferences, and intermediately organized regional conferences. And as you can see on the map, we have a quite nice coverage over the globe, so to allow people to attend our conferences and not have to travel too far. The latest World Conference was in December 2017 in Shenzhen in China. Last year we had 4 regional conferences in Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Next to getting together and talking a lot, we also like to use these conferences to reach out to the region or the local communities to address local or regional problems, and maybe during the conference to help find solutions for some of the issues in the regions. We also stimulate participation of early career scientists or young ecosystem service specialists. We have a so-called YES community, which is very active. And overall, the whole ESP community at conferences, more than 20 or 30% of the participants are students or early career scientists. We also like to establish more permanent presence in the regions, and a few years ago in South Korea we established our first regional office, supported by the local government. And later this year we have our 10th anniversary World Conference in Germany. In over you see on the map lots of dots in Europe. So the partnership actually basically started there in 2008 at the conference in Germany. So we thought for the 10th World Conference it would be appropriate to come back to Europe. This slide just gives an idea of the diversity of the people attending our conferences. This one is from October last year when we had the European conference in Spain. But you can see that there were almost 20 countries represented from outside of Europe. And on the lower bar you see it's still mainly a science community, but we are making an effort to more and more engage with representatives from government and NGOs and the private sector. This slide shows the development of in this case in scientific publications, but I guess in the public domain it will be kind of similar, of the attention paid to the concept of ecosystem services. I think Kate also mentioned that in the beginning of the ESPA program, few people were talking about ecosystem services still, which was around 2008. But going back in history even further, in the early 1990s, there were very few publications on the topic, and actually 2 landmark publications that are often mentioned when people look back in time to see where this all started is an article in Nature in 1997, which to our own kind of dismay, the editorial board called Pricing the Planet. I was one of the members of the lead author was Bob Costanza, and written by a team of about 12 people, I think. And we submitted it to Nature, and we called it the total value of the world's ecosystem services and natural capital. But that was a long title, of course, and the editorial board liked the journal, liked the paper a lot, and they wanted to advertise the issue by putting it on the cover, but they used the short term Pricing the Planet. And pricing ecosystem services or nature was the last thing that we wanted to do. which is a kind of a fundamental difference with valuing something. Maybe again something we can talk about, but in the end it might have been a good thing because it raised a lot of interest and comments. Also, lots of more neoclassical economists were quite upset about it, and some funny and interesting comment we got was, who's going to buy the planet? Because pricing something means it's the exchange value, and so you put it up for sale. So that was kind of funny. But before I make too many detours, let me continue with this brief history. In 2005, the results of the Millennium Assessment was published, and after that you can see it starts really picking up with publications on the topic. Then in 2010, TEEP presented its results. In between, the ESP started becoming also more and more active. Actually, from this community, many ESP people were part of the TEEP study, and when it was launched at the Nagoya conference in Japan in 2010, was the moment that people started seriously thinking about creating this UN-based IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So we hope that ESP has been at least contributing to this development. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2012 we started this journal, and that really skyrocketed the number of publications. I think this is from 2016, the last number, but it's still going up quite rapidly. One of the things we want to do more is work even more with the policy and decision makers, as we have been doing already, both from the private and the public and the private sector. Last year we had a very nice example during our ASEAN conference in India, where the people from South Korea managed to get a small delegation from people from North Korea to attend our conference to discuss transboundary conservation issues, especially between North and South Korea in the demilitarized zone. That is a big issue, and people are maybe not used to the term concern. Hopeful that at one point, when there is peace between North and South Korea, then this demilitarized zone might suddenly become under pressure of rapid economic development, and they want to stimulate more kind of multifunctional, sustainable use and working with nature and the local people. Reaching out to the private sector, we are since a few years organizing so-called marketplaces during our conferences and having so-called business tracks to really sit together with representatives from the business community. And I'm very pleased that JNCC, since about 2 years, is actively helping us with organizing these business tracks. And in terms of improving or making structural partnerships, we have several MOUs with a number of organizations and are quite active in IPBES and the Natural Coalition. Finally, my almost last slide, some issues that we are still not struggling with, that's putting it a bit too strong, but in spite of all these years, there's still some debate and misconception about the concept of ecosystem services and natural capital. I think Kate also mentioned earlier that many people still look upon those concepts as being only about economic and monetary valuation, and then taking it even a step further and saying that automatically leads to commodification and selling out of nature, like the remark we got in 1997 about who's going to buy the planet. I think that's quite unfortunate and leads to unnecessary polarization and opposition based on this misinformation, and causing a delay actually in the uptake of what we are trying to convince, that we need to change our economic system. We have to start taking properly account of those ecosystem services and start internalizing these externalities in the economic system. We basically need fair prices. I think that could solve a lot of our problems if we would just internalize environmental and social costs in the pricing system. Then there is still surprisingly debate about how to define ecosystem services. The Millennium Assessment made it quite simple and said ecosystem services are the benefits of ecosystems to human well-being. In the TEEP study, we had a long debate if, partly because it was focused on economics, to avoid double counting, you have to be a bit more precise about what is exactly the contribution of nature and natural ecosystems to these ecosystem services. So we use the definition ecosystem services are direct and indirect contributions of ecosystems to human well-being. And in IBES, there was a long discussion. And I also, many years before IBES, when I, especially in Latin America, was giving presentations, I often got this comment or question, yeah, is the ecosystem services not too anthropocentric, neglecting kind of the more non-monetary and kind of intrinsic values of nature and especially indigenous communities, their livelihood dependence and so on, which I fully agree is really important. But if you look at the definition, it does include these non-monetary values. But in people's perception, it is often still this economic and monetary valuation. So in IBES, another term was proposed to call it nature's contributions to people, NCPs.
Dolf?
Yeah?
Diana is going to, in her next presentation, which we're running a little bit late now, Diana's going to go through this best stuff. So maybe if you could move a little bit quickly.
Yeah, I'm almost done. So we'll hear more about this in a moment and maybe in the questions. And well, I think it's important, but it might confuse the policymakers and practitioners we try to reach. And finally, there's still different classifications, which is in a more practical sense a bit problematic because it makes comparison with previous research and data difficult. And this is my last slide, which I mentioned earlier before already, that we are getting together in Hanover, and I hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dolf. Now we'll move on to Diana and IPBES.
Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity and ecosystem services. Is this going to work? I'll do this as a joint effort between me and Lucy. Okay, so what is IPBES? IPBES is an independent intergovernmental platform. It's not a panel, it's a platform. It brings together member states, which are currently 132, joined since 2012. It's supported by a range of UN bodies, and its primary aims are to provide policymakers with scientific assessments which will enable them to make better policy judgments through the combination of different science. So a lot of people compare IPBES to IPCC. Obviously, it doesn't have the same profile as IPCC yet, but then IPCC has been going for 25 years and we've been going for 7, so we've got a long way to go. And one of the key things it does is supports the requirements coming out of CBD and CITES and these kind of groups that are asking for scientific information that can bolster what they do through their work programs. Okay, so IPBES has 4 main elements to its work program. Probably the best known is its work on assessments. So a number of these have already been completed, for example, on pollinators and land degradation, so working on a thematic basis. There are methodological ones, so on scenarios and modelling, and there's one underway currently on valuation across the whole topic of different valuation methods. Could be quite a seminal piece of work when it comes out in a couple of years' time. There's also been 4 regional assessments, and a global assessment is due to be completed this spring. So what makes an assessment special? Well, in the case of the land degradation assessment, there were 98 selected authors, so authors are put forward either by governments or organisations, and then they are chosen to work on things. You get early career fellows, you get additional authors, you get extra people that you think you might know something about this, and then these people sit down and in this case they analyse about 4,000 scientific papers and brought them together. The idea of an assessment is it doesn't tell governments what to do, but it provides signposts for what they could be doing and how they can address the issues that they're undertaking. So in addition to the assessments, the three other areas work on things like policy support. So that's how can we make sure that governments have the right kind of tools to actually enact or get on to the issues that are raised through the assessments. Building capacity and knowledge. So that might be working with, for example, the CBD, looking at where it's also recognised that there are fundamental issues in the ability to enact the things that are important to them, and seeing how can you, for example, use early career scientists or hold workshops in countries so that people can respond to consultation documents. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And finally, communications and outreach. If you don't have that, what's the point of doing any of the other? No. So that's it in a nutshell. Now what I want to turn to is its conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is very important for ITBES because it represents how the natural and social systems that operate at various scales and times all interact together. And it has 6 main components to this. So there's nature, which is to do with biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also things, different constructs of nature. So we're talking about ideas such as Mother Earth, and it also includes intrinsic values. The next bullet point down is nature's contributions to people, which I'll go into more detail in a minute. We've got anthropogenic even assets, so these are to do with the built environment. So whether you're talking roads, hospitals, financial systems, they are part of the process. We have institutional and governance and indirect drivers. So that's the actual system that we work in as a whole. So, you know, it doesn't actually lead to a direct change itself, but the way that say for our society is structured has an impact on the environment. There's also direct drivers of change. So that might be natural drivers, whether that's something to do with climate or something to do with man-made drivers. So we're talking about land use change. And finally, there's this good quality of life, which is a very interesting element. You know, how do people get fulfilled lives? And what that is not easy to say everybody has to earn $3 a day and then they're all above the poverty line and the world is a happier place. That doesn't work that way. It's understanding the cultural and social elements that make people's lives fulfilled, because that's what everybody's seeking to achieve in the long term. So, as I mentioned, I was going to talk about nature's contributions to people. Well, in the first iteration of the conceptual framework, we talked about nature's benefits to people, and the idea was that whilst that was, you know, everyone thought, yeah, nature provides lots of things for people, and I think that fitted in quite well with the viewpoint at the time that we were looking at the monetary aspects and trying to show that it didn't necessarily have to have a monetary aspect to understanding how the environment was important to people, but how it benefited people in other ways. Nature's benefits were seen as ecosystem services and other concepts that relate to ecosystem services. So this is taking in more indigenous and local knowledge perspectives. So that didn't fit very well. So we went on to nature's contributions to people. And this is where we get this shift from, actually, sometimes nature's quite harmful to people. Mosquitoes can give you malaria. Well, are we going to celebrate that? That's something else that we need to consider. It's also this idea that nature always gives benefits, whereas it's actually more in the term, using the term contribution makes it seem more neutral. So it does have pluses and minuses. And using the word contribution also shifted the association away from a financial thing, because in a lot of cultures, when you talk about a benefit, people think about monetary benefits, not necessarily about wider holistic benefits. The term nature's contributions to people also acknowledges that people have diverse relationships with nature. So people use nature, but people are also part of nature. And that might be through a spiritual or cultural relationship. And NCP recognises and that's not national car parks. It might help you to remember the acronym NCP, national car parks. No, nature's contributions to people. It's there somewhere. So the concept of NCP recognises that values vary spatially over time as well. So we heard through some of the other talks that how people view the environment now might change depending on their personal circumstances, on the way, for example, climate change impacts on them. There are many things that affect how you react with nature and what you see as a good quality of life. And therefore, by adopting this term, nature's contributions to people, it better sought to take a more pluralistic and balanced approach to valuation that acknowledge many worldviews, but also acknowledges that it goes beyond an economic discourse, and that there are many other ways that you can value the environment and take these things into account. The concept of NCP seeks to understand these human-nature interactions by bringing in these different knowledge systems as well. One of the really interesting things about ITBES that goes beyond some of the other multilateral environmental agreements in the past is this idea that you need to incorporate indigenous and local knowledge into the process. And actually finding ways of getting that knowledge in is very difficult, because sometimes actually they don't want to share it because that's part of their culture, is to hold it as their own information. So there are many different diverse worldviews, and how you incorporate that information in to enable you to provide information to policy makers in a way that meets that context is something which is really important, and something which ITBES is trying to do through developing a broader understanding of the concept of ecosystem services, natural capital, and how people interact with the world. Just to recap, nature's contributions to people does not replace ecosystem services, but it seeks to work with it as a concept. It enables you to take the more wider views, and it also hopes to go beyond a Western perspective. So, you know, everything has to be scientifically tied down and replicated and quantified and this is the way we do it in the West. It's not. That's not the only way to understand the environment and bring it into your decision-making perspectives. So in some ways, NCP is more than cultural ecosystem services. The spiritual aspects linked to culture are hard to limit to a cultural service. So how you react with the environment, I should imagine everybody in this room doesn't feel like a single cultural economic service can necessarily represent how you interact with the environment. So, for example, food production might be seen as a provisioning service, but if you think about how some cultures interact with food production through the growing, gathering, preparing and eating of food, and how that is very important to their relationship with the environment. So in this way, the concept of nature's contributions to people takes on non-material human-nature relationships as well as the material relationships, so enabling you to get this much wider, broader and inclusive approach to the environment. So both terms are relevant, neither of them are more important than the other, but what's important is the context and where you use it. So for some people, using the term ecosystem services will be exactly the right way to get into their brains and show why you're trying to do something for the environment. For others, nature's contributions to people would be a more appropriate way of doing it. It enables you to take both a monetary and non-monetary approaches to the environment and give those equal weighting in the work that you're putting forward. And these are tools, they're not requirements, they're tools. These things are to be used where they make a difference. Not everything has to be rammed into a NCP, ecosystem services, natural capital approach. Most things that we do in, for example, JNCC have a relationship to it, but sometimes it can be hard to see, you know, that's the direct benefit line. So it's important that you don't feel that you're compelled to do something in a particular way. And that, as they say, is it, folks.
Okay, we have just a little bit of time for a few questions. Do we have any questions? Well, let's check on the chat line first. Vicky.
Just if I just ask any of the speakers if they've got examples of governments actually using natural capital system services ideas to actually make decisions. We've got quite some case studies, but I just wonder if we've got any governments. We used to talk about Costa Rica, but I don't know if that's still relevant.
Well, for example, the example from Peru, where the Lima water utility, which I think is I'm not sure whether it's private, but it required a change in the law that allowed them to spend money outside of the capital. So there had to be a recognition that the services that land managers essentially in the uplands, by managing their land differently, they were providing better flow to Lima. So that then required the law to be changed so that the water utility could then contribute to the costs of that land management. So that might be a good example.
Diana, did you?
Well, I was just thinking that the 25-year plan, has natural capital as a key element of it. Obviously, it's the enactment that's going to be more interesting part of it.
What comes to my mind is in the European Union, the new biodiversity strategy, or it's not so new anymore, used as the subtitle investing in natural capital or something like that, which forced all the European governments to indeed start identifying and quantifying and eventually valuing and internalizing ecosystem services in government policies. So that might also be an example of uptake.
Question is, are there any good examples of ecosystem service assessment methods which policymakers can use?
So I think a policymaker would not be expected to use an assessment method themselves, but they need to be able to access good data, and there are increasing numbers of tools like Costing Nature, Water World, and so on that really do provide data even at quite a high resolution on a number of different services. But I think that is still quite a challenge, getting the data that has the right spatial and temporal resolution to decision makers.
Yeah, what comes to my mind listening to this question is that within ESP we are, I briefly mentioned it, developing guidelines to do integrated ecosystem assessment and use that for planning or management and decision making. And that consists of 9 different steps. It's not just simply looking at those ecosystem services, but you first have to define scope of what you're looking for, in what decision-making context you want to do the assessment, then what the direct effects are, indirect effects on ecosystem services, the benefits, the non-monetary implications, the monetary implications. On the top of my head, then the next step would be how to capture that value, thinking in terms of payment mechanisms or something. And then the last step would be how to institutionalize that. And for each of those 9 steps, there are different tools. And in starting to develop the guidelines, we came to a list of more than 80 different tools, some of the ones that Kate just mentioned and many more. If you go to the website of the Ecosystem Service Partnership and click on guidelines, you will find a whole list of those tools. So it's a simple question, but the answer is not so simple.
Some people suggest that using the term ecosystem services is confusing for policymakers and we need a different one. Therefore, the suggestion of natural capital. My fear is that natural capital is too narrow and loses the richness we get from ecosystem services. I think we need to continue sharing and communicating before we give up the term. What do you think?
Give up the term ecosystem services. I don't think that's where nature's contributions to people sort of tries to encompass everything. Unfortunately, I think that's probably as confusing as all the other terms out there. And what we're trying to do is take away the confusion from policymakers. And the impression I get from the groups that I'm with is that it's almost like you don't know how your car runs. There's an engine underneath there and it's got a load of components, and how those components work is understood by mechanics. And in some ways, the people that are working on ecosystem services and natural capital are the mechanics, and what you're trying to present is the finished article of a car that works. And so finding, generally for me, finding terminology that resonates with the group that you're trying to influence is more important than being a slave to words that we use in our sort of silo cohort of ecologists. But
I would say that one thing that we felt at the end of the ESPA program was if we had to reinvent it again today, we wouldn't be using poverty, we'd be using well-being, as I explained a little bit in the presentation, and we probably wouldn't be using ecosystem services either, because it was a term that was extremely difficult to get traction with amongst policymakers, also amongst social scientists. It took quite a while within that 9 years of the program to bring social scientists on board, who are absolutely essential for understanding the institutions and governance aspects of moving us forward on this. And we didn't come down on what we would use, but probably something like nature and environment, contribution would be better. But I tend to agree with Diana that you have to use the terminology that works for the audience you're trying to influence or that you're trying to work with. And
Yeah.
I guess the one thing I would say is that, we shouldn't throw out older terminology either. One thing that frustrates me a lot, having come from a history of working on non-timber forest products, is when I hear people saying, oh, ecosystem services research only started sort of as on your graph, Dolf, very recently. And I'm thinking, yes, but we did a huge amount of ecosystem services research a lot earlier. We just called it non-timber forest products or non-timber products. And it was a lot of useful research happened then too.
Yeah. No, definitely. Also, the term natural resources, of course, was used before, which is kind of linked to non-timber forest products. In my own earlier writings and of others, we were using the term ecosystem functions. Only later that became ecosystem services, and ecosystem functions were more related to kind of what is happening in the system before you use it. So functions can lead to an ecosystem service, but not necessarily. And then indeed, when the deliberations about ESPA started, people started looking again for another term. I fully agree with Diane that it depends on the context what term you use. Maybe you remember the definition that we used for ecosystem services is basically the same as nature's or ecosystems contributions to people. But if people ask me that have never heard of ecosystem services, I explain it by telling, that are nature's contributions to people, or the benefits you get from the functioning of ecosystems. So you always have to kind of discuss it. So yeah, I don't think there is a simple, I don't know who asked the question, maybe that person has a suggestion what other term might capture everything, but I don't think, after working on this now for more than 35 years, I think that there will ever be an answer to this question.
Ecosystem services and natural capital are interlinked but different. Is there at this stage any best methods to actually assess the stocks, as it seems that at the moment ecosystem services are the focus, with many different tools and methods existing and developed? But what about natural capital accounting or assessment within your organisation?
Yeah, towards the end, the question gets broader and broader. Maybe Kate wants to respond to the first part about the stock versus flow. I think you mentioned it in your presentation.
Really, okay. I think one needs to look at both, is all I can say. There's a real risk in only looking at flows of certain products, certain services. It doesn't give you the whole picture, but it's a good start. So yeah, I think that'll have to be my last word. So I'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Okay. My last comment on the last part was about the link with natural capital or national accounting, actually, I think you were saying. And I think that is quite fundamental. That touches upon the statement made by Pavan Sukhdev that we have to change our economic compass. And that's where the kind of the monetary part comes in mostly, I guess, to change the way how we internalize or not internalize those externalities and let all those benefits and values of ecosystem services really come back in our economic accounting of costs and benefits of everything we do. And then if you internalize it and are honest about those costs and benefits, I think the whole problem solves itself. Then the more how do you say, the cheapest alternatives of doing something, going shopping or developing your land, also is then the more sustainable. And now it's just exactly the other way around. So I think I'm kind of an incurable optimist to believe that at some point we will reach that stage, that we start to charge an honest price for the milk and for everything we do.
I think the thing is that a lot of work has been done on the stocks, and that there's a better understanding of what stocks we have. What I feel that we perhaps lack our understanding of, and what Kate mentioned quite a lot in her presentation, was about the trade-offs between what do people want the environment to do for them, and how can we do it in a way which is equitable. And that is really hard, whether you're in the UK or in Africa. It's really hard. And the involvement of more social science in this process, I think, would be really helpful for making the links between what we actually have and where we actually want to get to, and is the way forward, maybe. Who knows?
Well, let me thank all of our speakers today and our audience. I think it was a very interesting presentation, and again, my sincere thanks.